The tape was rolling. The cigarette smoke had thickened into something you could almost chew, hanging between the ceiling tiles and the mixing board, in layers that the ventilation system had long since given up fighting. It was late 1970, deep into a Detroit winter that had already swallowed the last of the daylight before 5 o'clock, and the men gathered in Studio A at Hitsville, USA, had been arguing for the better part of an hour. Berry Gordy's proxy, a senior A&R man whose name has been deliberately left out of nearly every account of this session, stood with his arms crossed near the door, his jaw set with the kind of institutional confidence that comes not from talent, but from proximity to power. He had a list: songs, arrangements, projected units, demographics. He had everything a Motown executive was supposed to have in 1970, and none of it included what Marvin Gaye was trying to make. The session had begun ordinarily enough. Marvin arrived late, which was not unusual. What was unusual was who he brought with him. The man who stepped through the studio door behind Marvin that night was not a session musician. He was not a songwriter, not a producer, not anyone whose name appeared on a Motown payroll. He was 6 feet tall, built like something forged rather than born, and he moved with the unhurried ease of a man who had spent years being the most dangerous person in any room he entered. His name was Lem Barney, and on Sundays in front of 60,000 people at Tiger Stadium, he was the most feared cornerback in the National Football League. Nobody in that studio knew what to do with that information. The A&R man looked at Barney the way people look at something that doesn't belong in the category they've assigned it. Not with hostility exactly, but with a kind of bureaucratic confusion, as if the filing system in his brain had thrown an error. Detroit Lions, Pro Bowl. What does any of that mean in a recording studio at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night? But Marvin didn't explain. He never explained. He just pulled off his coat, walked to the piano in the corner of the room, and sat down. And Lem Barney sat in a folding chair 6 feet away and waited, because that was what they did. They had been doing it for years. What the Motown machinery had never fully processed, and what the A&R man in that room was about to discover, was that Marvin Gaye and Lem Barney had been moving through the same Detroit all along. Not the Detroit of press conferences and highlight reels and hit records, the real one. The Detroit of 1967, still smoking from the riots. The Detroit of black neighborhoods where a Pro Bowl cornerback and a soul singer occupied the same block parties, the same church steps, the same conversations about what America was actually doing to the people it claimed to celebrate. Lem Barney was not a singer who played football. He was not a curiosity or a novelty act. He was a man with a voice, a deep, warm, instinctively musical instrument of a voice. And Marvin had heard it long before any microphone did. Their friendship had started the way most real things start, without intention. A mutual acquaintance, a gathering, a moment where Marvin heard Barney humming something under his breath and stopped mid-sentence to ask him to do it again. Barney was embarrassed. Athletes in 1969 did not sing, not publicly, not on record, not in ways that could complicate the two-dimensional image the league and its sponsors had so carefully constructed around them. But Marvin was not asking for a performance. He was asking for a voice. There is a difference, and Marvin Gaye understood that difference better than almost anyone alive. The A&R man cleared his throat. He had a schedule to protect, a budget meeting in the morning, and a growing sense that this session was sliding somewhere he didn't have a map for. He reminded Marvin, with the particular brand of patience that powerful men deploy when they mean the opposite of patience, that the label needed commercial product, that the formula worked, that Marvin's romantic catalog was a proven revenue engine, and that departing from it represented, and here he used the word carefully, a risk. Marvin listened to all of this from the piano bench without turning around. When the man finished, Marvin played a single chord, just one, let it decay into the room. Then he said, very quietly, that he wasn't making the album for the formula. He was making it for the people outside. And then he nodded to Lem Barney, and Lem Barney stood up and walked to the microphone. Nobody who was in that room that night has ever been fully able to describe what happened next in terms that satisfy the people who weren't there. The clinical version is this. Lem Barney sang background vocals on several tracks that would eventually appear on What's Going On, the 1971 album that would be ranked among the greatest records ever made in the American popular tradition. That is the documented, verifiable, historically accurate version. But the clinical version leaves out the part that mattered, which was the sound itself. The way Barney's voice, completely untrained, completely unguarded, landed in the room like something that had always been there and was only now being acknowledged. Marvin heard it and closed his eyes. The engineer at the board stopped making adjustments and just listened. And the A&R man, still standing near the door, with his list and his demographics and his projected units, did something he almost certainly had not done in a professional context in years. He went completely quiet. The thing about Lem Barney's voice was that it didn't sound like a football player trying to sing. It didn't sound like a celebrity cameo or a marketing stunt or any of the categories the music industry had ready to dismiss it with. It sounded like grief that had learned to stand upright. It sounded like the particular texture of Black American life in a Midwestern city at the turn of a decade that had already cost too much. Marvin had been searching for that sound for months, layering his own vocals over and over again, trying to build a kind of harmonic truth that felt collective rather than individual. He needed voices that belonged to the same reality the songs were describing. And Lem Barney, who had grown up in Macon, Georgia, who had watched everything the civil rights movement promised and everything it still hadn't delivered, who had learned to move through a white-dominated professional sports world with his dignity surgically intact. Lem Barney had that reality running all the way through him. The session went until 4 in the morning. The A&R man left around midnight, which everyone in the room interpreted correctly as a concession. He would file his report. There would be meetings. Berry Gordy would eventually famously call What's Going On the worst decision he ever made, right before it became the best-selling Motown release in years and the most critically acclaimed album the label had ever produced. But that was later. That night in Studio A, with the snow coming down outside and the tape rolling, and Lem Barney's voice finding its place in the architecture of a song called Mercy, Mercy Me, none of that institutional reckoning had happened yet. There was just the music, and the men making it, and the particular silence of people who know they are inside something that will outlast them. What almost no one outside of Marvin's immediate circle knew was how long this had been building. Barney had been coming around the studio informally for over a year before that night. Not to record, just to listen, to sit in on sessions, to exist in the creative space that Marvin had been slowly constructing around himself as a kind of fortress against the label's commercial imperatives. Marvin trusted very few people by 1970. The losses and betrayals of the previous 3 years had carved channels of suspicion into him that ran deep. But he trusted Lem Barney with a specificity that said something about both men. Barney didn't want anything from the music industry. He had his own arena, his own identity, his own professional reality that existed completely outside the machinery Marvin was fighting. That independence was, paradoxically, what made him essential to the record. There is a version of this story that the music press spent the next 50 years not telling, and the reason it wasn't told is precisely the reason it should have been. The narrative of What's Going On has always centered on Marvin's singular vision, his confrontation with Berry Gordy, his political courage in insisting on an album that Motown's entire corporate logic said should not exist. All of that is true, but the album was not built in isolation. It was built with community, with the specific voices and presences of people who embodied what the songs were about. And Lem Barney, whose name appears in the album's liner notes in a place where most listeners' eyes slide past without registering, was one of the foundational pillars of that community. His voice is in the record, not as decoration, as structure. The NFL did not know what to do with this information when it eventually surfaced in interviews and profiles years later. The league in 1971 was not a place where players were encouraged to have cultural identities that complicated the clean narrative of athletic competition. The implicit deal was legible to everyone inside it. Perform on the field, be grateful, stay in your lane. Lem Barney had spent his entire professional football life navigating that deal with extraordinary skill, winning on the field with an intensity that no one could question, and living the rest of his life as a full human being in ways the league preferred not to examine too closely. Singing on Marvin Gaye's most politically charged album was not, in Barney's own accounting of it, a rebellion. It was just the truth of who he was. That the league found it inconvenient was the league's problem. Marvin understood this. He had been living the same structural reality inside Motown for over a decade. Celebrated, profitable, and perpetually pressured to remain within the boundaries of what the institution had decided he was for. The parallel was not lost on either of them, and there is a quality to the conversations they had during those late studio nights, in the accounts that exist in the margins of various biographies and oral histories, of two men who had each found the specific language of their respective systems and were fluent enough in it to know exactly where the walls were. Marvin kept walking into the walls. That was his method. Barney went over them so smoothly that the men guarding the walls often didn't notice until he was already on the other side. When What's Going On was released in May 1971, the response was immediate and disorienting for everyone at Motown who had predicted catastrophe. The album sold. It sold in the way that things sell when they are telling people something they already knew but had not heard said out loud before. Critics searched for language adequate to what Marvin had done, and mostly came up short in ways that were themselves instructive. The music had arrived from somewhere outside the existing critical vocabulary, which meant the existing critical vocabulary had to expand to accommodate it. And somewhere in the harmonic weave of Mercy, Mercy Me and Right On in the title track itself, in the layered voices that built the emotional world of the record from the inside out, was Lem Barney, a Hall of Fame cornerback, a Detroit Lion, a man who showed up to a recording studio in the middle of winter because his friend was making something true and he wanted to be part of it. Berry Gordy eventually came around to the album in the only way institutions come around, to things they initially resist. Slowly, after the evidence became impossible to argue with, and with a revisionism that quietly displaced the memory of the resistance. The A&R man who had stood at the door with his list was not mentioned in the subsequent accounts. The arguments were softened into anecdotes. The story became, over time, one of triumph rather than conflict, which is how institutions process the rebellions they cannot undo. But Marvin knew what it had cost, and Lem Barney knew what it had required. And on Sunday afternoons that fall, when Barney was back at Tiger Stadium, making quarterbacks' lives miserable in front of 60,000 people, and Marvin's album was playing on car radios all over Detroit, there was a private understanding between the two of them that didn't need to be spoken. They had both been in that room. They both knew what had happened there. That was enough.